The second lesson looks at the 1919 election. So after Ebert takes over, one of his major tasks, as I said last lesson, was to start and prepare the new democracy for elections, its first real elections, to elect its first real representative government in 1919. The second task it had is possibly even more important. That is to form a constitution, a set of rules for how this country is to be governed. Each country, broadly speaking, has a constitution, and this constitution outlines a type of government system, the rule of law, etc., etc., etc. And this is a monumental task, but an incredibly important one for a new government, and that's what they have to do right away. Now, the first elections for what becomes known as the National Assembly are held in January of 1919. When given power in November 1918, right at the end of the war, Ebert was tasked with, like I said, two things. Number one, he had to maintain order, okay, and then second, hold a general election to choose a legitimate government or a national assembly for Germany. And this national assembly would then be tasked with writing the constitution. The results of these elections are actually really encouraging for all of the people who wanted different forms of government, be it communist or be it maybe even a return to the monarchy of the Kaiser or some sort of right-wing military-led government. The results of the 1919 election are incredibly encouraging for the Weimar Republic. The parties within the electoral system that were democratic and were in favor of a democratic republic won a huge victory in this early election. The big winner was the Social Democratic Party, the party of Ebert, who believed that the best way to get something resembling socialism was to do it through the democratic process. The leader of the new party, and who becomes Germany's first chancellor, is a man named Philipp Schneidemann. And that's really all you have to know about him. This new government met in the city of Weimar because Berlin was still affected by the lawlessness of the Spartacus uprising. And due to this, of course, it's given the name the Weimar Republic. It completes its work on the new constitution, its first task once being elected by June of 1919. And the new constitution creates a system of government that effectively looks like this. At the top of the government is a president. This is a good comparison to the head of state, or the Queen here in Great Britain. And the president is elected on a 7-year term. Okay, so unlike a constitutional monarch where there is an unelected monarch at the very top, the president in the German system, and like the French system, sits at the very top of government on a 7-year term. And they have quite an important role, a role that supersedes that of, let's say, a constitutional monarch. The army, okay, is accountable to the president, and the supreme commander of the army is the president. They have the ability to use something called Article 48. And I'll talk a little bit more of that in a second, to pass laws if there seems to be deadlock or problems or emergencies that requires the president to act without having to wait for a divided parliament, for instance, to sit. But perhaps the president's greatest job is to appoint and dismiss the chancellor. Now, the chancellor is the equivalent of the prime minister. This person appoints a team of ministers to form the government: a minister of health, a minister of education, a minister of economics, etc., etc., etc. And it's totally accountable to the Reichstag. So, in other words, what's passed in the Reichstag cannot contradict what the chancellor can't contradict what's passed in the Reichstag. And the Reichstag is equivalent to the House of Commons, okay? This is the people who win their seats in national elections. The chancellor isn't always, like in the British system and the German system, he isn't always the person who has the majority of votes. It's the person most likely to achieve the majority of support of the varying parties in the Reichstag. That said, the Reichstag does hold the chancellor accountable, okay? They serve a 4-year term, they can be ministers, okay? They pass the budget, they make laws, etc., etc. Overseeing the Reichstag, or their equivalent of the House of Commons, is the equivalent of the House of Lords, known as the Reichsrat. It's comprised of the representatives of each of the 18 German provincial state parliaments. They could veto Reichstag laws, but of course then the Reichstag had the ability to overturn a veto if it had a 2/3 majority support. So the Reichsrat was an overseer. It didn't have complete veto powers because it could be overturned with 2/3 support in the Reichstag, but Nevertheless, it was a second level of government to ensure that the laws that get passed in this country are accountable to all constituencies in this party. So it's quite a very democratic system. In fact, it's one of the most democratic in the world at this particular time. Let's take a look more at the important positions here. So the Reichschancellor and Reich Cabinet. So the Chancellor, as I said, was appointed by the President. The President appointed the Chancellor after an election, and it usually represented the most popular party, but not always so. The Chancellor became the government of Germany. So this is the leader. So in Germany today, which has a very similar system to the Weimar Republic, Angela Merkel would be the Reich Chancellor. The Reich Chancellor presides over the government. Under Article 54 of the Constitution, the Chancellor and ministers are accountable to the Reichstag, so they can't do anything that the Reichstag doesn't want them to do. They don't have unlimited power, and they have to resign if they lose confidence of the Reichstag. So if the Reichstag passes a vote and says, we don't have confidence, we want a new Chancellor, the Chancellor must resign, cannot stay in his position, and the President can appoint, or rather must appoint, a new person to fill that role. That makes the second most important person in Germany the President. This person is elected on a 7-year term. He's elected by the entirety of the electorate, and he had to win over 50% of the vote. The President was head of state and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and had the power to use something known as Article 48. And I'm going to elaborate on this and the importance of this in some good detail right about now. Article 48 of the Constitution is one of the most controversial aspects. Those who say that the Constitution of the Weimar Republic was a failure and it led to the Nazis point directly at Article 48. This gave the President emergency powers to do whatever is necessary to restore order. What it doesn't do is give the President a definition of what constitutes emergency powers. Therefore, if the President constitutes whatever situation it happens to be an emergency, he can use Article 48 to pass laws that do not require the permission of the Reichstag. So it's an element of almost dictatorship in a sense, but they're only in the sense, I suppose, that the President can pass laws without the consultation of Parliament in the event of an emergency. The first President elected, and his term was to run from 1919 to 1926, was Friedrich Ebert. And Friedrich Ebert, of course, as you know, was the person appointed to head the government and establish the Constitution in the first place. And Ebert decides not to become the Reichschancellor or run in that election. He decides that he will run for the position of president. And he becomes the Weimar Republic's and Germany's first president in 1919. Now, a couple important points on Article 48, okay? The passing or using of Article 48 requires a small group of people to introduce laws without having to secure the approval of an elected lawmaking body such as the Reichstag. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution states that in the event of public order and security being seriously disturbed or endangered, the Reich President may take measures necessary for the restoration, intervening, if necessary, with the aid of the armed forces. Now, very ill-defined use of Article 48, Article 48, which means that Ebert, during his time, will use it 136 times. Now, we know that Germany is chaotic at the end of the First World War. It's beset by tons of problems, social problems, such as communists on the left wing, nationalists on the right wing. It has economic problems. It has the problems of the Treaty of Versailles about to loom over its head. And this leads to massive chaos around Germany. Now, to use it 136 times, though, some will argue, is an example of dictatorial powers, and some will argue that Germans get used to the idea of a leader leading without consulting Parliament, which makes Hitler's acceptance and the acceptance of a dictatorship by Hitler all the more easy for some Germans. It's a contentious view, but one that's certainly bandied about, and a lot of people say that the use of Article 48 was one of the major failings of the Weimar Constitution because it removed people's attachment to the democratic process as a way of solving problems. The Reichsrat, perhaps the least useful part of the German government, but nevertheless a necessary part of it, is the upper house, okay? This represents the 17 or 18 states, the Länder. The states are represented in the Reichsrat by members of the state government. It could block laws made in the Reichstag, but the Reichstag could also override this with a 2/3 majority, as I said before, and that's all you really need to know about that. The Reichstag is the most important lawmaking body. Okay, this is the House of Commons where laws are passed. The members in the Reichstag are elected on 4-year terms by a system of proportional representation, which means that voters cast votes. They cast votes for a list of candidates. And that list of candidates could be as many as 30 long. Each party received 1 seat in the Reichstag for every 60,000 votes they receive. And the Reichstag cabinet seats actually aren't fixed. So in the American system, for instance, there are 538 seats in the House of Representatives, and that is a constant. In the Reichstag, there could be 500, there could be 450. It really determined by how many people show up to vote. It equals how many seats a particular party gets in the Reichstag. Now, Germany is divided into 35 equal districts. Parties draw up a list of candidates. Voters vote for the party list as a whole. Voters choose parties in this system of election, not candidates like you would here in the UK. And like I said, for every 60,000 votes in a district, a party gains 1 deputy. The number of deputies in the Reichstag is not fixed and dependent on the vote cast. And how is this sometimes viewed as problematic? Some people say that this system of proportional representation, as opposed to other systems that Germany could have used, such as the first-past-the-post system, which we use here in the UK, how did that lead to instability? Well, let me explain. These systems of proportional representation really try to achieve a close fit between the national vote, okay, and how many seats that they have in the elected assembly or parliament, in this case, the Reichstag. In proportional representation, a group that said receives 40% of the vote will receive exactly 40% of the seats in the Reichstag. In the UK, the party winning the largest number of votes in each constituency wins the seat. That's known as first past the post. First past the post does not produce a proportional result. It generally yields a dominant majority party. That is why, for instance, in the UK, you could actually have a situation where the party with less of the popular vote actually wins the federal election, as was the case twice in the 20th century when Winston Churchill lost the popular vote but won the prime ministership. Yeah, he did that last in 1950, and then again in 1968 when Harold Wilson lost the popular vote but won the prime ministership because he was more popular in smaller constituencies rather than the large inner cities. Now, what all of this means is that you have a system in Germany which allows lots and lots of parties into the Reichstag. So for instance, let's just take an example like the Nazis. What happens in the late 1920s is the Nazis, whereas they wouldn't have even got a seat in the UK Parliament, in the German Parliament are allowed seats in the late 1920s because they are able to poll relatively highly in a few small rural constituencies. And this gives them a foot in the door they wouldn't have otherwise had they been operating in a small 2 or 3 party first past the post system as we have here in the UK. So some people argue that the system of proportional representation imposed on Germany was inherently problematic. That's a difficult thing to say. But what we have ultimately is a notion of parliamentary government. A parliamentary government is a government where the leader, the chancellor, the equivalent of our prime minister, has to have the support of the Reichstag to make it work. Germany's multi-party tradition, meaning that Germany had a tradition even before the foundation of the Weimar Republic with the old Reichstag of the Kaiserreich, of having dozens and dozens of parties in the Reichstag. And this multi-party tradition meant that no party really ever had a majority in parliament, which made it hard to rule. Now, if you don't have 50% of the seats in the parliament, you always have to work with other parties to get anything done. This meant that the role of the chancellor was incredibly important. The chancellor, as much as leading the government, had to be a peacemaker. If you want to pass a law giving bread to the poor, you have to ensure that you have more than 50% of the vote, which usually means that 2 or 3 parties have to come together, combine their seats, and vote in favor of a particular bill. That meant that the chancellor was very important, which by effect meant that the president who chose the chancellor had a vital role in this government, since there was sometimes, and most notably, every election after the first, no obvious chancellor. Appointing the chancellor was often the case of choosing the person most able to win consensus or majority support in the Reichstag by forming a coalition. This was a source of instability. What we see throughout the time of the Weimar Republic is frequent changes of chancellors. The Weimar Republic is only around for 14 years, but there's 11 different governments. And this system of proportional representation, some argue, created instability. And when there's instability in your government system, people are more likely to look for other solutions to what type of government they want. And some will say that the Nazis come to power, simply put, because people were frustrated with the inability of the Weimar Republic politicians to work together in this proportional government system. Evaluating the Constitution. I'm not going to run you through this. This is an incredibly important slide because so much of the types of questions that they will ask you on the Constitution will ask you to talk about the degree to which the Constitution was strong or weak, the problems with proportional representation, the good things about proportional representation, problems with Article 48, and the good things about Article 48. Also, too, you're going to be prepared in this examination for those small describe questions, those 4-mark questions. Describe Article 48. Tell me 4 things about it. Describe proportional representation. Okay? So there are lots of different ways that this can be examined. It's an important topic. You do not have to know, and you will not have to ever draw out how this government system works. But what you do have to know is the certain roles and importance of the roles of various people. You will have to know that about proportional representation. You will have to know about Article 48 and why those could potentially be considered problematic. Because some people will say that Weimar was doomed from the start because its constitution was so bad. Something we'll look at in great detail in class over the next few lessons.